Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Good.
We're live. That's
We
exciting.
we are live. We are
Great.
here. How
Good.
are you today?
I'm good, thank you. How are
I'm
you?
doing really well, thank you.
Great.
I will kick us off and start us going.
Great.
My name is Carly Coons. I am the Director of Education and Programming at the Blue Dove Foundation and a licensed social worker. And I am really honored to be here today with Rabbi Amy Bardack, who is a spiritual leader in the Pittsburgh Jewish community. Amy, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. So, yes, I'm a rabbi in Pittsburgh, and we're here today to talk about communal trauma related to a holiday that starts tonight.
Absolutely, and we were meant to be joined by Rabbi Melanie Levav of the Shomer Collective, who is unfortunately recovering from COVID and so isn't able to join us, but is here with us in the chat. I see the chat going. So they were instrumental in helping us put together this Instagram Live today. So they're with us here today.
Yes. Feel better, Melanie.
Feel better. We miss you. So exactly as you said, we are exploring the connections between modern communal tragedies and Tisha B'Av. And I want to, as we get started, just acknowledge for people who are viewing that we will be talking about difficult topics today. So please take care of yourself as you are engaging in this with us. But we also really appreciate you taking time to have this conversation with us. So a little bit about Blue Dove. We are an organization that focuses on mental health education through a Jewish lens. So using these types of conversations to reduce stigma around mental illness and addiction in the community. And the Shomer Collective focuses on improving end-of-life experiences for individuals and their families, inspired by Jewish wisdom, values, and practices. So that's sort of how this came about today. So as we're starting to have this conversation, Rabbi, could you just give us a little bit of an understanding of what is Tisha B'Av? What is this holiday? What does it commemorate? Why do we have this holiday?
Sure. So it is the most solemn day in the Jewish calendar. It begins at sunset tonight and concludes at sunset tomorrow night. And it's a 25-hour fast day where there's also prohibitions against doing things that you enjoy, including studying Torah. It's the only day in the year where we are not allowed to study Torah. And it commemorates two primary communal tragedies in Jewish history. One, the destruction of the first temple in the 6th century BCE by the Babylonian Empire, and then the destruction of the second temple in the 1st century CE by the Roman Empire. And those cataclysmic events are what is commemorated and really what makes it such a solemn day.
Okay. Yeah. It's really interesting because it sort of holds like the same weight almost as any of our other fast days where we're really spending time thinking about and reflecting on what's happened, but also being present and thinking forward in the future too, which I think is really interesting. As we're diving in a little bit more, we're going to think about what is grief and mourning, how do those distinguish? I'm going to talk just briefly about trauma, and then Rabbi, I have a bunch of questions for you, and so we can kind of engage in those together. As we're thinking about grief is that experience that we experience internally after a significant loss, such as a death or a tragedy, and that's really the internal experience. Whereas mourning is the outward expression, the outward thoughts and feelings that you engage with your community, with your group of people. Grief is a really normal experience, and the way that we experience it is very different for each of us, and varies over time. We don't recover from grief. I think sometimes in society we think, oh, we're going to recover and it will be great, but we don't recover. We sort of adjust and adapt as humans to figure out who we are as this new person. So when we're thinking about trauma, right, and we're thinking about traumatic events of old, right, of destructions of the temple, but also in today's modern society where we have experienced communal tragedies as a Jewish community, as a global community. Trauma is the response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope. And what's really interesting is it's such a unique experience, much like grief. The way we respond to trauma is different. The way that our timeline is different. We might feel it immediately after. It might take days, months, years. And it's a really unique experience. And secondhand trauma is also a huge thing. So you don't even need to personally experience a traumatic event to be impacted by it. Just talking about it, just witnessing, just hearing about an event can be enough to trigger those feelings, and that response is as real as if you had experienced that traumatic event firsthand. So that's sort of, as we're going to dive into a little bit of a conversation around the Pittsburgh shooting in the Jewish community. Just wanted to sort of acknowledge that the way that we interact with trauma and the way that grief impacts us as individuals is so unique. And just to have that in the back of our mind. So as we're thinking about this, Rabbi, what was the immediate response in the organized Jewish community like?
Okay. So at the time I was working at the Jewish Federation, which is, like in most cities, a centralized Jewish organization. Mm-hmm. In Pittsburgh, compared to other places I've lived and other places around the country, it is an unusually strong federation where they really are the conveners of everybody else, and like at a heartbeat can contact anybody and all of that. We're also a smaller Jewish community than, say, Boston or New York or LA. So we're tight. We all know each other. So when this happened, within the first hour, the CEOs of the three big Jewish agencies, the JCC, Jewish Community Center, the Federation, and the Jewish Family Service, they were in contact with each other within the first hour and made a plan, which was all these questions that happen when you have a mass casualty event. Yeah. So you have to find a place for families to wait to find out what happened to their loved ones. In normal times, that's a hotel. I mean, when it's not a Jewish community, when it's a Jewish community, it wasn't going to be a hotel. Sure. So it was, the JCC said, we'll do that. We will be ground zero for the FBI, for the Red Cross, for the family waiting area. And it often takes hours to identify who's dead. So it's like many, many hours people need to be somewhere. And then the JFNCS, Jewish Family Service, said, okay, we'll provide counselors and therapists. And we will, for the first week at least, we will be open 24/7 in the JCC for counseling. And you know what? We also should reach out to the Center for Victims, which every state has kind of a secular organization that helps with victims of crime, and they came forward and they said, we have trained therapy dogs, and they brought them. And so it was like the JCC was sort of command central. And the Federation took on donations, media, which was enormous, people from the outside wanting to help, convening various groups. Okay, so what had to happen within the first 48 hours was I gathered all the Jewish clergy to just say, like, we have 11 funerals. Not sure the rabbis of those congregations can do them because they themselves were victims. So who's up for doing a funeral? Who's up for making sure there's a Shiva minyan? Where are we going to have these huge funerals? You know, all of that had to be figured out. Within the first 48 hours, there was a community-wide meeting with our Jewish community security director. We had that in place for a year before this happened, and lives were saved because of the trainings, active shooter trainings we had already done in the community. So people knew where to run. So we also had, like, things popped up that we weren't in control of, like teens did a vigil on a very busy street corner that was Saturday night around Havdalah. The Israel Trauma Coalition kind of showed up, and they're an institution of therapists that help with trauma in Israel, but the government sent them immediately. And so we were like, who are you? How do we use you? We had to figure that out.
Right.
What we did also, this was a Shabbat, the next day was Sunday, and we didn't want to cancel religious school. So we made sure those first 24 hours by that Sunday that every synagogue, religious school had a social worker or therapist or chaplain there on site.
Wow.
So all that was done extremely quickly.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because as I'm thinking about it, right, it's you're almost in that, you're not almost, you were in that fight, flight, freeze mode where you were just moving. You had to make decisions, and you had to make decisions collectively, which I think can be really challenging. And also it sounds like you had some systems in place already to support you in making those decisions.
You are right. What we had that was really an advantage that we've seen later that other communities didn't have, and it was to their disadvantage, is we had good relations with everybody. The mayor, the county executive, our congressional representatives, the Muslim community, the Christian community. Like, we all knew each other.
Yeah.
We could reach each other very quickly. So all of that really eased this. And also I think our federation is very good in a crisis.
Yeah.
Houston was good in a crisis when they had a huge hurricane.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes these Jewish federations are stepping up. They didn't ask to, they didn't plan to, but our federation's good in a crisis. So.
Wow. It was very fortunate. Something you mentioned, about, this is how the Jewish community did it. I wonder, what sorts of things were uniquely Jewish in your response, in the community's response, since this did happen within a Jewish community? What was Jewish about this response?
Lots. So we were in touch a little bit later with Parkland, which happened, that shooting happened 7 months before.
Right.
But it wasn't a federal hate crime. And it wasn't Jewish, obviously, so it was different. Mm-hmm. But we learned a lot from them and actually built relationships with them. But anyway, it was particularly Jewish that we had as the first mass casualty event like this in the Jewish community in America.
Yeah.
We had no playbook.
Right.
We were building the plane while we were flying it. I mean, it was crazy. But right away, we do know how to do death in Judaism. And we have these rituals that really help. So right away, we have two Jewish burial societies, which are called Shomer Collective, which prepare the bodies for burial. Mm-hmm. So right away, the Orthodox one and the non-Orthodox one, they went right to the scene. Now, we had to very quickly educate the FBI and law enforcement that, like, please let these people in, because no one could go in. So please let people in. They're going to clean up the blood and the body parts and make sure, in our tradition, every body part, this is the only gruesome thing I'm going to say, has to be buried with the body. Yeah. So they have to be involved in this. You have to let them in. And so, basically by the end of 24 hours, I think the FBI director and the Orthodox rabbi hugged, and they're best friends. But we had to make that happen so that the Shomer Collective could do the religious rituals that are accompanying preparing a body. Yeah. The Red Cross always has disaster spiritual care providers who are volunteers, and they knew to send rabbis. So, most of them are not Jewish, obviously. Right. So they sent rabbis. So that was really helpful. We had to right away, because it was Jewish, we had 3 homeless congregations. There were 3 congregations in the Tree of Life building. So we had to figure out what's going to happen the next Shabbat. It was clear, okay, we want to be together. We want to have a space for these congregations. So we ended up planning that, one gigantic service with 1,500 people in a huge sanctuary in one of the big congregations. And every congregation that was impacted had a role in the service, So someone who was not me was planning that, which was great. I just knew it was happening. I wanted to make sure it was happening. What is interesting about trauma and communal trauma is that, and this is not Jewish, this is anywhere, people are 5 times as likely to turn to clergy compared to therapists in the immediate wake of communal trauma, because they're looking for meaning. And so everybody was calling the Federation and saying, I have to talk to a rabbi right now. Yeah. And rabbis in the community were getting people coming in off the street, and was what are we going to do about this? Wow. And the other irony for us was we had 4 certified Jewish chaplains in Pittsburgh at the time.
Mm-hmm.
3 of them were victims of the shooting by coincidence.
Yeah.
So we only had 1 certified Jewish chaplain in our community.
Wow.
So it was like really clear. I didn't want the Red Cross chaplains to leave.
Yeah.
And so it was really clear that we needed to have chaplains for a while. So we had a string of chaplains come along and they all volunteered, but that was part of meeting the needs. I mean, I am the community rabbi at Federation. We have another rabbi who's also at Federation, but we couldn't meet with all these people off the street, you know.
Right.
And so that was also like a uniquely Jewish sort of problem. Let me tell you, it is not every day that people are dying to talk to a rabbi. Just saying.
Right. That's really interesting, actually. And I did not know that statistic that people are 5 times more likely to speak to a spiritual leader than a therapist. And when you say that, I think cognitively it does make sense to me, especially in the light of a religious, trauma like this in a religious institution, in a spiritual space. Something you've mentioned a couple times throughout that I'm curious about is that balance of your professional role and your personal needs, right? The chaplains knowing that they could not be in their professional role because their personal needs needed to supersede that. So I'm curious for you, or just in the community at large, what did that balance look like of taking care of yourself while also still being a professional supporting the community?
Well, I'll give you an example of a few, and I can talk about myself too, but the most gravely injured person was one of the most highly respected Jewish chaplains. He was in the hospital for 5 months.
Wow.
He was, almost died. So he was not available.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And, the other 2 were survivors who were, in their own trauma. So they couldn't function professionally as chaplains at that moment, right?
Yeah.
So there was that. And yet they were involved in their communities.
Yeah.
At Federation, one of my colleagues, we put her on travel. Like, she negotiated with hotels and airlines to give big discounts or freebies to families coming in for the funerals. Because not all the families live in Pittsburgh, right? And she got married in Tree of Life. Her daughter's bat mitzvah was in Tree of Life. Her father's photo is hanging on the wall as the men's club president. And she was doing this. We had our community person for young adult Shabbat programming called One Table, our coordinator of that. 2 of her cousins died in the shooting. And we wanted her to be involved in a Friday night dinner the first Friday night after. Obviously she couldn't. So One Table flew in somebody from the national office to do this program.
Yeah.
So that's just a few examples. For me personally, I am a mother of now young adults, then teens, high school students, and one of them was quite upset because one of her very good friends, we didn't know she was alive. She was one of the rabbi's daughters. And so she was quite beside herself, especially that day when we didn't know anything. And she didn't leave me. And so when I came, I walked down the street, I see the CEO, because it was my street where they were all convening, right? I walked down it's Squirrel Hill, it's a tight neighborhood. I walk down and I see the CEO and he says, "Come on, we're going to the JCC." So I follow. My daughter's holding my hand. She's 14. And then we get there and they say, "Amy, come on up. We're going to plan a vigil for Sunday night and we want you there." And I'm sitting there with my daughter pulling my arm and the big guys going upstairs. And I said, "No, I'm not going to be involved in the vigil." At that moment, I knew I had to be a mother first. And I also knew there were plenty of male rabbis with egos who would be just fine running that vigil. Yeah. And they were. Yeah. So they didn't need me. Right. And it was so clear that at that very moment, I had to be with my daughter. The other thing I remember from that very moment is we had a very young employee at Federation in her early 20s, and she was tasked with finding hotels for Israeli dignitaries who thought they were really important and they had to fly in. Yeah. And so I said, "How's it going?" And she said, She started to say, this hotel's full, this hotel, that she starts crying. And then I say, okay, let's stop talking about hotels. How are you doing? Again, like, she needs to take care of herself and not just power through and do the hotel. So really, it has been not just in the acute phase, but in the long-term phase, self-care is really important. So some people in trauma, they can't eat and they can't sleep, and some people eat all day long and sleep all day long. Like, people can respond in opposite ways, and so you have to take care of your body because you really feel trauma in your body. Like, for me, I was on complete adrenaline. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, I couldn't think. I was like on automatic. And so the only way for me to take care of myself would have been to remove myself from a situation and slow down, which was very, very hard to do because we were in like emergency mode. But really, you have to make some space for that, or you're going to collapse. And it's really like when you get out of the acute phase, like by the third week, let's say, out of the very acute phase, where maybe people are starting to eat and sleep again, then you're more available to kind of tend to yourself, I think. But it's always a balance.
It's a balance, and there's no, as I think you said, there's no playbook, right? Whether it is a large scale tragedy or it is a smaller scale tragedy of an individual death, there's no playbook for how do we care for ourselves and also be the leader. But I do think as Jewish communal professionals, that is something I hope we continue to work on is figuring out what does it look like for us to care for ourselves while also caring for others, right? How do we put on our oxygen mask before putting on someone else's so that we are awake and alert to put on someone else's mask, right? And I think it takes learning. I think it takes understanding how do these things impact you, and also these things have a cumulative effect. So when we experience one trauma, one tragedy, right, the next one we experience adds to that, right? They're not separate events. We're not separate beings. We live in one body. Our mental, our physical health are all interconnected. And so I think it is a really interesting thought around how do we as communal professionals make sure we understand how to care for ourselves so that we're doing it just day in and day out, but also if and when a trauma happens, that we can be there and show up and also take care of ourselves. So it's a really interesting question.
And there was less than a year and a half between our shooting and the onset of COVID, which was its own communal tragedy, worldwide, not just the Jewish community, obviously.
100%.
But we hadn't really gotten back to resiliency after a year and a half.
Right.
And like the stage of what we call reconstruction usually doesn't happen till after the trial, when it's a mass shooting, hate crime thing. And we are in the trial right now, 4.5 years later. So I would say when COVID started, we weren't recovered. And so we went right back into emergency mode. Like, we all knew what emergency mode was. But I will say, like, thinking about taking care of yourself, it's really hard for people like teachers who are on with children all day. So we had Jewish day schools, and we brought in, and some of the teachers aren't Jewish. So we realized, like, these Catholic priests called me and they said, we're available. And I thought, oh, you go and take care of the non-Jewish teachers in these Jewish preschools and day schools, because they're going to need to talk to somebody, so you want to think especially about those kinds of professionals who are on with children all the time, because then you can't take care of yourself publicly in any way, and that's really hard.
Absolutely. It's such an interesting piece, and I think as we're talking, and as we were talking before to prepare for this, what I realized is that there were so many pieces that I didn't anticipate you sharing that you had to think about or deal with or figure out how to navigate. And I think that is a theme within traumatic events, within tragedies, is that so much comes up that we can't even possibly imagine. And it takes a lot of work to sort of coordinate and navigate those things as they arise. And so as I'm thinking about how do we care for each other and ourselves, I think the gift we can give ourselves ahead of anything happening like this is understanding who are our people? How does our support look? What does that look like? How do we get that what does care for ourselves look like? So in those moments that we have like a little bit of an understanding of what we might need, it might look different in different situations, but I think being in touch with ourselves and our needs and what we need to care for our physical and mental health can be really empowering in moments of tragedy.
And some of that is community education, like Blue Dove does and the Shomer Collective, because community education around trauma means like, I didn't know it was happening to me that I couldn't eat.
Yeah.
Like, I never have a problem eating.
Right.
And like and if I had only known right then, if I'd been schooled in this, that these are the signs of acute traumatic response, right? It's all in your body. Then I would have said, oh, that's what that is. And that would have been helpful.
Yeah.
So community education, I think, is really important so people can recognize what's happening to them in that moment.
Absolutely. And I think, especially as we're thinking about mental health, I think that's one of the most, it's like the baseline of everything we can offer, right? Is education around mental health, understanding how it interacts with our physical body, understanding basic signs and symptoms so that if and when something arises, we have something to lean back on. It doesn't mean that you'll immediately pull it up and have total recall, but it gives you something enough to know to say, I think this might be related to something else, or I think I might be concerned about something I'm observing for myself or for others.
Right. And one of the gifts we had was from Israel Trauma Coalition, because they came and they said, can you get people together? Because we want to teach about trauma across the community. So we're like, okay. I mean, we trusted them for some reason. And they met with first responders. They met with law enforcement. They met with educators. They met with social service workers. They met with clergy, rabbis, and taught us the basics of trauma. And they met with parents and teens. I mean, we were just like organizing this the first week, along with the funerals, along with everything else, because people needed to know how to take care of each other and themselves. And they didn't just come because we're Pittsburgh. They came to Parkland 7 months before, and the mayor gave them the keys of the city because they were so helpful to them. So it's not like they're Jewish only, but it was they're trauma educators. So that was really, really important.
It's wonderful. Well, as we're starting to wrap this up, I just wanted to see if you had any final thoughts or things that you wanted to share with us as we're ending this.
Sure. One of the things that you and I had talked about is like, what is good help and what is not good help? And what happens in these communal tragedies is the crazy people come out. Like people come out who say, I am the world's best art therapist and only I can help your community recover from trauma. And my fee is $1,000 a day. Or or people coming up and saying, I am the foremost specialist in trauma. I am able to help you. Please book me a hotel and pay for my flight. And my daily fee is. I mean, you would not believe that. Also, people who are good-hearted come. We had 6 buses of youth group teens who wanted to come support us the first Shabbat after. And they needed home hospitality and they needed food. And we said, don't come. You know what I mean? That's not helpful. That's a burden. What was helpful was people to come quietly without ego and to say, what can I do for you? That's what's helpful. And it's not making further demands and making further work or claiming that you have unique expertise. It's almost like the soft skills of trust, which I had with Israel Trauma Coalition. The soft skills of trust. So really keeping at bay the people who wanted to do things, and some of it was funny, the Jewish Motorcycle Club that wanted to make a steel tree of life and do a motorcycle parade across the country and end in Pittsburgh, but we had to organize a ceremony. So we said, not now. Thank you, but not now. So these were the kinds of like really funny, crazy things that happen. And not every person who helps is truly helpful. And so just ignore the people who aren't going to help you and who are going to create work for you.
Well, and it also sounds like you drew some boundaries, right? Which is so imperative when you are just in daily life, really, but especially during a traumatic event, having those boundaries to say, this is helpful, we want to engage, this is not helpful, thank you for offering though.
So we had a whole contingent, a car full of rabbis from Montreal. They showed up. And like my office was the morning minyan, the morning services at a synagogue. That's where everyone came.
Sure.
And they said, oh, we're here to help. What can we do? And I said, well, we really need more people to wash bodies. Can you do that? Like for the prepare for burial? And they said, oh, no. Well, then if you're not going to do what we need, I can't talk to you right now.
Right. It's interesting. So Shomer Collective and Blue Dove Foundation this past spring launched 2 incredible resources around supporting individuals through traumatic death, supporting communities for individuals, for professionals. It's a really interactive resource. And a few of the sections really look at what does it look like to really support somebody who has experienced traumatic death, who has lost someone, right? Whether it's a singular event or a larger tragedy. And that's sort of what those sections dive into, is what does real, thoughtful help look like? And how do you ask those questions so that you are in service of the person who needs support as opposed to being in service of yourself?
Completely.
And when you need to be in service of yourself, which sometimes we do need to support ourselves as supporters, right? How do you lean out to get that support from other people so that when you're leaning into the community or into the family that needs your support, that you can really genuinely be there for them? And I think some of the stories that you're sharing really illuminate what does that look like to really support for the intention of supporting the person who needs you.
And I want to close, Carly, by sharing one thing that I didn't know at the beginning, none of us did, but that we learned, which was best practices in communal tragedy is it's all about the victims. Everything has to start with the victims' families and the injured, because they are the ones most closely impacted. And good to communal trauma puts them and their needs and desires at the center, not the needs of the political officials and this leader and that group and that group. And we wished we knew that. We just didn't. But when we learned it, that really informed everything else we did, like the annual commemorations, like the memorials, all of these things were really informed by that principle that is so very important.
And in those guides that I was talking about, there's actually an activity called Circles of Support, where it is a visual representation of the circles.
Concentric circles.
Exactly. Yes, with those individuals, those immediate victims, the immediate people in need of support in the center. And then what does it look like outside of them, really supporting them? And then where do you find your support within that grid as well?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Wow. Well, I want to say thank you so much, Rabbi, for having this conversation with us, really helping us think about, what does modern communal tragedy look like as we are entering Tisha B'Av this evening. And thank you for being willing to share your story, which was, I know, very vulnerable, and we really appreciate it. So thank you so much.
You're welcome, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you to the Shomer Collective, the teams at the Shomer Collective and the Blue Dove Foundation for helping us put this together today. The guides to supporting individuals through traumatic death, both for individuals and communities, you can find those links in our link in bio for Blue Dove as well as Shomer Collective. We hope you engage with them and sort of use them as a resource before meeting them. And again, Rabbi, thank you so much. You have a wonderful rest of your day and a meaningful Tisha B'Av.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.